Take from this world only to the measure of your needs, and forego that which exceeded them. Observe equity in all your judgments, and transgress not the bounds of justice, nor be of them that stray from its path. Baha'u'llah. Reflect upon the inner realities of the universe, the secret wisdoms involved, the enigmas, the inner relationships, the rules that govern all. For every part of the universe is connected with every other part by ties that are very powerful and admit of no imbalance nor any slackening whatever. Abdul Baha.
One of the most pressing problems of humanity in the current century is how a growing, rapidly developing, and not yet united global population can, in a just manner, live in harmony with the planet and its finite resources. Certain biological realities present themselves when an organism negatively affects or exceeds the capacity of its ecosystem. The limited availability and inequitable distribution of resources profoundly impacts social relations within and between nations in many ways, even to the point of precipitating upheaval and war. And particular arrangements of human affairs can have devastating consequences for the environment. The question of the impact of climate change and to what extent it is man-made and its effects can be ameliorated is today a major aspect of this larger problem. The revelation of Baha'u'llah directly and indirectly touches on a range of such concerns in a manner that speaks to a harmony between society and the natural world. The Universal House of Justice.
Thank you. So today our speaker is Mr. David Langness, and his topic is the one unavoidable solution to climate change, a unified world. Mr. Langness edits and writes for Bahá'íTeachings.org, the world's largest Baha'i website, which he's helped nurture and build since 2012. Prior to Bahá'íTeachings.org, David's extensive 30-year career as a communications executive resulted in the creation, design, and operation of major communications campaigns. In 1986, David co-founded Homeless Healthcare Los Angeles, the largest Skid Row service agency formed to assist the chronically homeless. David now serves as the vice president of the board of directors of Hospitality House, the nonprofit homelessness agency in Northern California's Sierra Foothills, and as the chair of the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Nevada County. David is married to the novelist and poet Teresa Langness, who founded and continues to lead Full Circle Learning, the global educational NGO now active in 34 countries. David and Teresa, who live and work in Grass Valley, California, have 4 grown children and 4 grandchildren. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Langness.
Thank you, Peymane, and welcome, everyone. So good to see you all, or at least the black screen with your white names on them. I see about 10 pictures of actual people, real faces, and the rest are just names. But it's so nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. The other day I was in the car dealership getting my car serviced, and I was standing there waiting for them to bring my car up after it was finished being serviced. And there was a young guy who came in and he was speaking to the service manager. And the service manager they were both looking at his car, and the service manager was saying, "How long has your check engine light been on?" And the guy said, "Oh, it's been on for months." And the service manager looked and said, "And this is the first time you're bringing it in?" And he said, "Well," he said, "when the light went on," this was the young guy who was driving, "so when the light went on, I stopped, I opened the hood, I checked the engine, it was still there, so I kept driving." That was his version of doing something about the check engine light, which remained on. And that's what's happened with the Earth. The check engine light is on. Last week, a group of scientists from the University of Copenhagen issued a new report. And the report is really fascinating. I commend it to you if you read these kinds of things. Essentially, it's a report on the 9 planetary boundaries that science has established for the Earth. And the lead in that report, which was published in the journal Science Advances last week, says human activities are inching dangerously close to triggering dramatic changes in Earth's environmental conditions. The quote from the authors that leads the report is, "This planetary boundaries framework update finds that 6 of the 9 boundaries are transgressed." 6 out of 9. Let me tell you what those 9 boundaries are. I didn't know myself when I saw the report, even though I try to follow climate change science closely. The first, of course, is climate change. And we know that we're exceeding the limits each day now. Second is ocean acidification, the actual acid levels in the oceans. Third is ozone depletion. That's the only one where we're doing better. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Fourth is nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. That's because excess nitrogen and phosphorus, the things we use in fertilizers, disrupt ecosystems, especially in the ocean. Freshwater use, we're way in excess of what we should be in terms of freshwater use, especially pumping water out of aquifers. Land system change, you probably know that as deforestation. That's how they term deforestation, as land system change. Biodiversity loss, that's the other great big one, next to climate change. Atmospheric aerosol loading, there's a scientific conundrum. And pollution from chemicals. Those are the 9 boundaries that science has established. We have now gone past 6 of them. Just like the guy at the dealership where I was, our check engine light is on. It's been on for quite a while, and we're kind of ignoring it blithely and continuing to drive around. So the question that I wanted to address in this brief talk this morning, it's actually afternoon for some of you. It's 9 o'clock where I am in California. The question that I wanted to address is, what role can religion play in this whole arena? And you just saw in that little musical interlude there from Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical on climate change, that religion is involved in this arena and heavily involved now. The leaders of all of the world's major faiths have now weighed in on climate change. The Pope is one of the latter ones to do it. The Universal House of Justice, the global administrative body of the Bahá'í Faith, did so in 2017, 6 years ago, and in many ways before that as well. But all of the world's major faiths have now had something to say about climate change, accepting its reality, accepting our responsibility for mitigating it, etc. All of those religious groups have decided to address the issue of climate change by broadly applying the ancient teachings of religion. And there are 3 main ones that really apply here. Love for others, of course, which all religions encourage us to manifest. Concern for the well-being of humanity as a whole, for all people, which of course is a tenet of every great faith. And stewardship of the natural God-given environment. We're taught, even in the Old Testament, to tend our garden. And the earth, as we know, is our garden. So that's our job now, to tend this garden and to do so with love and with concern for all humanity. This is not only a Baha'i teaching, this is the teaching of every faith. Every legitimate religion puts forth these three primary principles. Unfortunately, the world, especially here in the United States, has become really polarized over this issue in a political sense. So how do Baha'is address it? I'll try to answer that question. Number one, one of the primary principles of the Baha'i faith. Baha'is didn't invent this. This was given to us in the revelation by Baha'u'llah, the prophet and founder of the Baha'i faith, and Abdul-Baha, his son and successor, is the principle of the agreement of science and religion. Baha'is firmly believe that science and religion are two limbs of the same tree, that they must be united. In fact, Abdul-Baha said, every religion which is not in accordance with established science is superstition. That's how strongly the Baha'i teachings address this question of science. Abdul-Baha exalted science. The Baha'i writings do so in many, many places. And he said the highest praise is due to men who devote their energies to science. The highest praise. The noblest center, Abdul-Baha said, is a center wherein the sciences and arts are taught and studied. Science illuminates the world of humanity, and ignorance takes us down, the Baha'i writings say. So really, that's the very first principle that Baha'is take into consideration when they start thinking about how to deal with and understand climate change. The second, as I mentioned, is the exaltation of scientists and their work in the Baha'i writings. And the third is something new, completely new in the history of all religion. And that is the Baha'i faith has an administrative system that provides continuing contemporaneous guidance on emerging issues. And that administrative system starts at the local level. It's all democratically elected at every level. Local, regional, national, and finally the Universal House of Justice, which I mentioned, which is really the world's first elected global system of governance. And that global system of governance has now begun in the last 6 years to address climate change very specifically and to ask Baha'is to work to ameliorate its impact. Let me talk about that for a minute. 2 years ago, in its fifth assessment report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which most of you have probably heard of, it's the UN panel on climate change, scientists from dozens of countries. Their report said continued emission of greenhouse gases, in other words, burning carbon-based fuels, will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. That is the considered judgment of the world's scientists. Not all of them, and some climate deniers will tell you that, well, there are scientists who don't agree. That's true. They represent maybe 1 or 2% of the body of the world's scientists. The conclusion that I just read to you represents somewhere between 97 and 98% of the considered opinions of those scientists. I think that that is really, really important from a Baha'i perspective, not only because Baha'is respect science and see it as incredibly important in the world, but because it turns on the check engine light for all of us. It makes us begin to think, if we think deeply about these things, and all of us should, that our natural world is in peril. We're in trouble, folks. And if you're aware of that, if you know it, if you've read the science, if you understand what the scientists are telling us, then you know that we have to take some action. We have to do something to move away from these great difficulties that we brought upon ourselves as human beings. So about 7 or 8 years ago now, we had an interesting exchange of views at BahaiTeachings.org. And that exchange of views was really fascinating. A couple of our writers, myself included, wrote about climate change, and we got a number of comments, not a ton, but some, from people who said climate change is not real. It's made up, it's a hoax, etc. And so in light of that discussion, and it was an interesting one, I wrote a letter to the Universal House of Justice. And all Baha'is can do that, of course. This is the global democratically elected body that administers the worldwide Baha'i community. And so I wrote a letter and I asked, is it possible, my letter is very short, just a paragraph, is it possible for the Universal House of Justice to weigh in on these issues, to give us some guidance, spiritual guidance on how to deal with these questions, since they have created so much controversy and polarization. The Universal House of Justice replied. It took them a while, but they did reply. And in December of 2017, they wrote a letter to the Baha'i world on climate change. And I was amazed by that. First of all, just to get a personal reply would have been really interesting, but for them to address it to the Baha'i world, I thought was remarkable. And then when my wife and I were in Haifa for our Baha'i pilgrimage in 2019, we were called in to meet with one of the House of Justice members in his office. It was just the three of us. And that House member, Stephen Birkeland, told us, he said, "We're so grateful that you wrote that letter." And I said, "Really? Why? You must have gotten many letters on this subject." And he said, "Yes, but, yours really impelled us to begin studying the issue." He said, none of the 9 members of the Universal House of Justice are climate scientists. And so we realized that we had to educate ourselves. We had to figure out, gosh, what is the science? What does the science really say? And he said, and so we embarked on a 6-month course of education for ourselves. He said, we ordered many books on the subject, scientific treatises, academic papers, etc. And we began to pass them from one member to the other. And we read for 6 months to educate ourselves on this subject before we felt that we could write, a coherent and reasonable letter to the Baha'i world to advise them how to deal with climate change. That was really fascinating to me. In fact, one of the things that Steve Birkeland said to my wife and I was, please write more letters. We would really like to receive letters from the Baha'is, more of them than we get now, on these kinds of subjects, because it helps us study those subjects, not become experts, but at least become well-informed enough to advise the world's Baha'is on these issues. So I was really thrilled by that. And as a result, I've really studied that letter. Here, I think, is the chief lead sentence from that letter. I'll read it to you. It's short. The House of Justice, did I say December? It was written 29 November 2017. The House of Justice says, humanity would be best and most effectively served by setting aside partisan disputation, pursuing united action that is informed by the best available scientific evidence and grounded in spiritual principles, and thoughtfully revising action in the light of experience. So 3 things, really simple. Setting aside partisan disputation. In other words, let's not politicize this issue and make it so polarizing. Pursuing united action, informed by the best available science and the spiritual principles as well, the 2 of them together. And thoughtfully revising that action in light of experience. So that's their guidance for us. Don't dispute over these issues. Act on them in a united way, guided by science and spirituality. And then take a look at what you've done and see if it's effective, see if it works. Analyze it and thoughtfully revise it as a result. Pretty simple. They also said one of the most pressing problems of humanity in the current century is how a growing, rapidly developing, and not yet united global population can, in a just manner, live in harmony with the planet and its finite resources. So that's our task. How do we live in harmony with the planet and its finite resources? Well, we do so from a Baha'i perspective, first by altering our own inner characters. And that isn't easy. Is there anyone who thinks that is easy? Please raise your hands. It's really difficult to do. It sounds simple, but it's really hard. And how do we do that? Well, we begin to pray and meditate and live our lives in a spiritual way so that we are not focused on ourselves, but so we are focused on the well-being of others. That is the chief message, really, of all religion. But it certainly is the chief message of the Baha'i teachings. The Baha'i teachings emphasize world unity, emphasize connection between peoples, emphasize the de-emphasizing of borders and nations, and instead the unity of the whole world. In order to achieve that, we must begin to love our brothers more than ourselves. You know, in Christianity, the watchword is love your brother as yourself. In the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah said we are asked to love our brothers more than ourselves. So we need to transcend self first, not think of our own personal advantage. How do I get more money? How do I get a bigger house? How do I get a fancier car? You know, what can I do to increase my status and standing in the world? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what can I do to lift all boats, to raise the consciousness and the consideration for all humanity in everything I do? And I'm not talking just about, you know, recycling and all the rest of it. What I'm talking about is a consistent love for humanity expressed in our actions. Baha'is see as a model of that kind of human being, Abdu'l-Baha, who dedicated his life to the service of others. And I'll just give you one of millions of examples. Abdu'l-Baha, before World War I in Palestine, asked a very large group of Baha'i farmers to begin farming what they thought was non-arable desert land around Haifa, which now, of course, is in northern Israel, but then was Palestine. And those farmers came, many of them from Iran and surrounding areas, Iraq. They established farms there and they began to work to grow crops. And those crops were mostly grain. That was what was growable in those areas. They grew fields and fields of grain. They proved that it could be done in that desert land with the right kind of irrigation. And they did so. And they did it for several years. And you know what Abdu'l-Baha did? He put that crop, that grain, in storage. He stored it in large stone retainers that were covered. And then when World War I broke out and the naval barricade was set up in the Bay of Haifa there, and no ships could come in, people began to starve for the obvious reasons. First of all, the military took much of the crops that were available, but also no ships could come in because of the naval blockade. And as a result, starvation set in. And Abdu'l-Baha gave that grain to those starving masses. The estimates were that he saved tens of thousands of people as a result. At the end of the war, he was knighted by the British Empire for doing that. He didn't really want to accept that honor, but he begrudgingly did. And so in his obituaries, you will see Sir Abdu'l-Baha sometimes, although he never went by that title. The fact is that he thought about humanity in advance of their needs. He acted in a way that was incredibly altruistic, and did so for people that often even opposed him. Many of the Muslims in the area, for example, did not like the Baha'is and opposed Abdu'l-Baha's work. But after he did that, a year later, when he passed away, his funeral was the largest funeral ever seen in the Middle East, with tens of thousands of people attending from every conceivable religious and cultural background. So the people loved Abdu'l-Baha not because of his faith, but because of his actions, because of what he did. And that is the true measure of a Baha'i. Abdu'l-Baha said that action is deeds, not words, from Baha'u'llah, is the measure of a true human being. And that's what we're called to do now. We're called to think about and act upon what is best for all humanity. I think I'll end there. I would rather have a dialogue than a monologue. I would love to hear your questions and talk about some of these issues. So thank you for coming. Just put your questions in the chat, and Peymane will help transmitting them to me. It's been wonderful to talk to you all about this subject. I hope you'll have some questions.
Thanks so much. That was a very necessary topic to talk about. Later this fall, I will be giving a short speech at a climate vigil hosted by local climate action groups. In a 10-minute speech, it will be hard to present a comprehensive presentation of a Baha'i approach to the topic of climate change. Do you have a short list of points that you think would be most important to include?
I sure do. I've written, thank you for that question, John. I've written multiple articles on Bahá'íTeachings.org about climate change. My suggestion is just go straight to Bahá'íTeachings.org, put the term climate change in the search box, the upper part of the screen there, and you will find those articles. And they often have, there are many of them, but they often have brief talking points that will allow you to draw from them. None of them are copyrighted. Hey, Monet, what do you think of that? She's a copyright attorney. And we purposely do not copyright them so people can use them at will. So feel free to draw from any of those resources. That's why they're there.
Great. Thank you. The next question is, how do we engage on this topic with our friends and family who deny that climate change exists?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I've had to deal with it myself. I know the feeling. You know, I tend, these days when I meet those who deny that climate change exists, I tend not to want to argue. I used to argue. Now I don't. Why? Because I don't think argument produces much except disputation and disunity. Instead, you know, I ask people what they're doing in life. You know, have you taken any measures to deal with our environmental issues? Is the usual question I ask. And I find that questions like that really tend to surface many of the attitudes that people have. So I try to really simply ask questions and listen. And that generally helps me relate to people who have different opinions or who have read different scientific conclusions. And I gently try to, usually after those conversations, suggest something. Oh, well, you know, if you read that, you might be interested in reading this. And I give them something, and that leads us to the next question, right?
The next question is, in the Baha'i writings, it favorably, for several reasons, encourages people to become vegetarian. Please comment on the importance of this.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely comment on that one. There is encouragement in the Baha'i writings. Abdul-Baha says that in the future, the primary food will be nuts and grains, fruits, vegetables, etc. Those are the things that I think Abdul-Baha foresaw us eating in the future. But he also said that the consumption of meat is necessary in some places in the world and in some cultures. On Baha'i Teachings several years ago, I asked a Baha'i who is a vegan and a Baha'i who is a hunter to write side-by-side essays, and we published them on the same day. And both of them wrote about their dietary practices and how they reflected what they found in the Baha'i teachings. And it was fascinating because both were able to justify what they did and what they ate in that way. I think the guidelines that Abdul-Baha set forth are meant for a future time in human society. We're not quite there yet. As the House of Justice has said, there are some cultures in the world that subsist almost entirely on animal protein. And that's just the way it is and will continue to be for some time. Personally, I don't eat red meat, and I haven't for 40 years. And I do so for a whole host of reasons, but most of them are because I grew up on a farm and cows were my friends. I used to milk the cows in the morning at 5 a.m. As a kid, I used to go out into the field and hang out with the cows and talk to them. And I found that, they were sentient beings. They had feelings. A friend of mine says when he's asked, "What do you eat?" he says, "I don't eat anything that blinks." So pretty interesting. From my perspective, this is going to take a while to get to a purely vegetarian lifestyle for everyone on Earth. We're getting there gradually, and it's a wonderful thing. And I encourage anybody who wants to do that to try and do it. If you can, if it's possible in the first world, to do that, then it's a great thing. Next question.
As Baha'is, how can we give hope to other people about the future of the earth, considering the existing circumstances like frequent natural disasters, wildfires, floods due to climate change?
Yes, that was the question I was wanting to get to. That's such an important question. I don't know if you've heard of it, but there are a number of books out now, and you see people like this on talk shows, et cetera, who have begun to use this term climate psychosis. And it's real. When I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's an exaggeration. It's not at all. It's especially real among young people. When you talk to young people, they have a great fear, an incredible sense of fear that their world will not continue to exist during their lifetime. I was talking to a young woman at a Baha'i gathering, just a couple of months ago, and she had just gotten married, and I was congratulating her and asking her the typical question, kids? And she said, I don't want to bring children into this world. And I was so saddened by that comment, and I talked to her about it for a long time. I said, what if that child is the scientist that solves some of the problems of the planet? We're assured in the Baha'i teachings that the planet will go on, that humanity will continue for hundreds of thousands of years at the very least. So Baha'is have an optimistic view, maybe not in the immediate short term. Things look dark, and the Universal House of Justice has said that very clearly, and they may continue to be dark in the short term. But in the long term, we will survive. The earth will survive. We will figure out ways to fix these problems. This new revelation, the Baha'i revelation, has many of those ways embedded within it. So I would suggest, and I just talked about this in a speech I gave in Canada a few months ago to a large peace conference. I would suggest 2 books for your perusal. And they are books that are just so profound. Do I have them here? Yes. One of them is a book that has really changed the way I think. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. Now, that may seem counterintuitive to you, but Steven Pinker, the author, who is a professor at Harvard, this is his life's work, and he spent years and years compiling the data that shows that over the course of human society, that violence in our societies has declined dramatically, even including the 2 world wars of the 20th century. This book will give you hope. And it'll give you hope by reading the 100 graphs and charts in the book. It's very detailed. If you want another book, and I don't think I have it here, if you want another book that's shorter and lighter and wonderful to read, there's a book called Factfulness. And Factfulness is by a Swedish physician who began to think that we're making our emotional judgments about the world in ways that don't consider the facts. And that impelled him to write this wonderful book about the actual facts of what's happening in the world. The book is so uplifting because what he does is he takes 32 metrics of human well-being in the book, and he looks at them historically, and he sees, for example, that world hunger has declined dramatically over the last 100 years, that world health has risen dramatically. So all of these metrics, these big, very large metrics, are considered in the book, and he presents the facts and says, if you lead a factful existence, a fact-based life, you can't help but be optimistic and happy about the general direction the world is going. So I commend those two books to all of you. They're not Baha'i books. They're science, essentially. And of course, Baha'is love science and believe that it agrees with religion. So I really hope that you'll all take a look at those two books and be uplifted by them. Next question.
Thank you. What basic things can individuals do to help climate change?
Well, there are hundreds of things that you can do. As was mentioned earlier, you can stop eating beef. One of the major causes of deforestation, carbonization, etc. You can drive an electric car. You can reduce your use of fossil fuels in any way possible. You can begin to speak to your family and friends about, gosh, let's all try and do this together. This will be fun. You can use solar on your house. My wife and I installed solar on our house several years ago. Our electricity bill is now $10 a month. The sun powers our car. So it's really a great thing. There are many, many ways you can do it, but I would say that the very first and the most important way that you can deal with climate change on your own, and this will sound very counterintuitive to you, is to pray and meditate using the Baha'i writings each day. They will give you a sense of world citizenship. They will connect you with all other people in the world. And that's what we need. That's the primary need for bringing us together as one human family. And guess what? You treat your family different than you treat others. You have more consideration for your family. And when we begin to realize that we are all one family, as the Baha'i writings tell us, then and only then will we begin to really have that altruistic consciousness that's necessary to think about, gosh, is this plastic bag that I'm carrying my groceries in, does it impact others in a negative way? Would it be better if I got a paper bag? Now, that said, I want to issue a caution. And this is the caution, and you'll find this in many books on this subject. The caution is this: we are not individually responsible for the environment. We have responsibility for our own environmental actions, of course, but many people lately have recognized the fact that large corporations, large energy producers, fossil fuel companies, etc., have gone into campaigns to convince us that environmental degradation is the fault primarily of individuals. It is not. If you want to assign fault, there's plenty to go around, but a lot of it lies at the feet of industry and the industrial practices that we have adopted in the developed world. So I would say that probably one of the most important things you could do, and I have a friend who's doing this, is buy stock in oil companies and go to the shareholder meetings and sit there and advocate in their shareholder meetings for an increased focus on renewable energy. That's a really big and important contribution. So there are thousands of ways you can do it, from paper or plastic to, dealing with the energy companies. The goal is reduce our use of fossil fuels, cut back on our general consumption, on our materialism. Don't buy so much new stuff, shop at a thrift store once in a while. And that, of course, the Baha'i teachings really focus in many ways on the elimination of materialism. And that is one of the big, big considerations and contributions that you can make, is don't be a consumer. Don't buy stuff just to buy. That's really important. Next question.
Next question is, I think Baha'is are interested more in the spiritual principles underpinning current issues such as this, rather than outward and manifest symptoms. What might be some spiritual underpinnings?
Well, I just talked about that a little bit. I'll talk about it a little more. First of all, it's interesting to me that we tend to, in our culture, separate the spiritual from the physical or the material. They're the same thing, folks. I mean, I hate to break this to you, but they're the same thing. How we live our lives in a physical way only reflects what our hearts and souls tell us inside. There is no separation. And so I would say to that question, do what I did as a young Baha'i when I was 18 years old, and go and spend some time on the Navajo reservation. That for me was a fascinating education. I was taught the Baha'i faith. I was raised as a Lutheran and became an atheist by the time I was 14, and was taught the Baha'i faith by 3 Native Americans, 3 indigenous people. One was a Hopi woman, wonderful woman named Elizabeth Dahe. One was a Navajo man. Another was from another tribe. And they all were the ones who taught me the faith, and they didn't do it by talking. They did it through action, by their deeds. And they did so by helping others. And that's how I wound up on the Navajo reservation. I grew up in Arizona as a teenager, and I went there with my Navajo friend who took a truckload of clothing, food, and medicine to the Navajo reservation once a month. And I went with him and just watched what he did. And I saw how the Navajo Baha'is lived their lives in unity, in what the Navajos called Hozho, which means beauty. And that example stirred my soul so deeply. And I began to realize at that point that our spiritual lives are not separate from our physical lives, that they're one and the same. And the Navajos showed me that, because in the Navajo belief system, the traditional one, there's no word for religion. They don't have a religion. That's just who they are. That's what they believe. And their beliefs are carried out in their lives. So I would say that the two are one. And that's why I really emphasized earlier, in response to another question, this idea of prayer and meditation, because it's only in spiritual reflection and we're encouraged as Baha'is to do that every morning and every evening, to read from the Baha'i writings and to pray and meditate, to reflect. It's only in prayer and meditation that we find the inner strength that impels us to go out and be altruistic people. That's where it comes from. I'm reading a biography now of Martin Luther King Jr. It just came out, 1,000 pages long. It's huge, but it is the definitive biography of his life. And one of the things in it that has really impressed me is that here was somebody who combined his spiritual life with his physical life in not every way, but most ways, and did so for the benefit of all humanity. And man, is that impressive. And he did it from a place of belief, from a place of, well, Christ asks me to do these certain things, and that means I need to do them. So I hope that answers the question. Next one.
Climate change can be considered a part of the poly crisis and is inextricably intertwined with, for example, gender and resource inequality. All of these are symptoms of not appreciating humanity's fundamental unity. How would you introduce evidence for the unity of humanity to people who would like to understand this important principle better in light of this poly crisis?
Wow, that's interesting. I hadn't heard it framed that way before, but that's really fascinating. I think for me, science has become the new religion in the West. And in some ways, there are good things about that. In other ways, it's terrible because science doesn't offer us any real moral guidance, does it? It just offers us scientific guidance about the facts. So the fact that science has become our new religion means that typically I try to approach people scientifically on these issues first, if that's their frame of reference. And I think that now there is so much great work being done by anthropologists, archaeologists, etc., on the origins of humanity and our essential oneness. I worked at UCLA for many years. I was the head of communications there, where everything medical, the hospitals, the medical school, etc. And I got to know, it was a great bounty in my life. I got to know a great many world-class scientists at UCLA, including one who won the Nobel Prize. And my wife and I got to go to the Nobel ceremony in Sweden with him and his wife, which was a great experience. Anyway, these scientists were some of my favorite people and still are, and some of them work in genetics. And so I spent a lot of time in the geneticists' labs and learned probably just enough to be dangerous on our common genetic heritage and how it transcends race, it transcends gender, it transcends every conceivable kind of origin story that humanity has told for decades, for millennia. And if you do just a little bit of study of human DNA and its universality, you soon find that we truly are scientifically one family. We're all at most 57th cousins. And that ties us together. One of the ways that I've found that is a fascinating way to do it, have you ever done 23andMe or any of the genetic testing regimens that are available now to find out what your heritage is? Boy, that's interesting. And everyone's interested in what theirs is. And so you can use that science to really begin discussing with people who are scientifically based the unity of humanity.
What do you think of starting an initiative to make large corporations accountable to reduce plastic packaging? companies such as Costco, Walmart. As I became more aware, I was shocked at how much plastic usage on the products selling at their stores.
You know, that's an excellent line of reasoning. There are existing organizations now. I'm involved in a local climate change initiative here that my wife and I helped start, called Nevada County Climate Action Now. And we've done a big plastics push here in our county to try to reduce plastic packaging. Of course, much of it goes back to the manufacturers. Excuse me, I'll get rid of this. And does much of the plastic packaging, of course, goes right back to the manufacturers. I have a friend who has worked with Walmart for many years. She was once the chief marketing officer of Walmart, no longer is. But she has begun a plastic packaging reduction campaign at Walmart, and they've begun to respond to it, I think, very positively. So I think you don't have to start anything new. You can just Google it, find out who's doing those campaigns, and join them.
Do you think we can address the spiritual benefits accruing from the melting of Greenlandic ice sheet at the present time in humanity's evolution? This melting was prophesied explicitly by Abdu'l-Baha in 1916 to 17 and was presented as being the result of the future intensifying faith of Greenlanders, which would increase the heat in both a spiritual and physical sense of the country.
Yeah, you know, Abdu'l-Baha in 1912, when he was here in North America for 8 months, giving addresses, talks, speeches all across Canada and the US. When he was in Chicago, he made kind of an offhand remark to someone there in Chicago. And this is only what Baha'is call a pilgrim's note. It's not authentic and part of the Baha'i writings. But I have heard this many times that Abdu'l-Baha said that at one time in the future, Chicago would be tropical. How frightening is that? It's really interesting. You know, the Earth's climate is changing, and it's changing in dramatic ways. And we know that the melting of the ice sheets, the rise in sea level, the rise in temperature. I live in California, and we've had wildfires everywhere. My wife and I have had to evacuate twice for wildfires in the last couple of years. We know that the carbon load in our atmosphere now is such that even if we stopped all fossil fuel burning today, that carbon load would continue to increase for the next couple hundred years. So many of the who I think of as the major thinkers around climate change these days are talking not any longer about avoiding climate change, but mitigating it, figuring out ways to live with what we've done since the Industrial Revolution, you know, putting a couple hundred years worth of carbon into the atmosphere. And that means that we have begun to start to think about ways to not only reduce carbon emissions, of course, reduce aerosol emissions, et cetera, but we've begun to think about, all right, what do we do now? How do we change our lives and move away from the materialistic consumer-based cultures that we've built to a different one? It fascinated me to read the other day that China is constructing 6 times as many coal-fired power plants as the rest of the world combined right now. And, you know, China is a developing nation. They had 1 billion people living in poverty 50 years ago during the Maoist revolution. And today, that's just not the case. Most of those people are, if you read Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, you'll see most of those people are in the middle class now. They're driving cars. China has traffic jams. in its big cities. I was first in China in 1988, and a car was an unusual thing to see on the road. You knew if you saw a car that it was a state official at that point. Not true any longer. China has become the largest consumer of cars in the world. So how do we fix that? Well, number one, we draw together all nations in one world government. We cannot even begin to approach the regulation of carbon emissions as 200 separate sovereign nations. It's impossible. And it's the big reason why we have not been able to deal with climate change in a real and significant way, despite all the treaties, despite Paris, despite all the rest of it. We have not really yet put a significant dent in our carbon emissions as a world. Why? Because we have 200 governments who are all dealing with it in their own ways or not dealing with it. Yes, we can stop all of our coal-fired power plants here in the United States, but unless we have some form of global governance, we can't stop them elsewhere. And that means that this crisis, in my view, is drawing us closer and closer to world unity. It's the only conceivable solution. Very few thinkers have really gotten to this point yet. Some have. But the truth is, we are compelled as a world to unite. This crisis will force us to do so. You know, it used to be when I was a kid, people would say the only way the world could ever unite is if we were attacked by aliens, right? Remember that? Those of us who are of a certain age. Well, guess what? We're being attacked by carbon, and it's going to affect every one of us. Every day now, there's a catastrophic weather event in the world. The floods that just occurred in Libya are just unbelievably catastrophic. And that, as it continues to happen, will, I'm hopeful, drive us closer and closer toward the realization that we must have global governance.
Aren't these changes inevitable? Are we forgetting that Baha'u'llah said more than 150 years ago, the world's equilibrium hath been upset through the vibrating influence of this most great, this new world order. Mankind's ordered life hath been revolutionized through the agency of this unique, this wondrous system.
You know, from a Baha'i perspective, yes, these changes are inevitable. But Abdu'l-Baha also said that the time frame is not inevitable. In other words, it depends on how we react as human beings as to how quickly and how painfully these changes can take place. We can resist them, which many people are doing. We can yearn for a world that used to exist but no longer does. We can try to go back to some imagined vision of the past in our political leadership or our just the way we think. But that won't work. Why? Because the world's equilibrium has been upset, Baha'u'llah said. So yes, the changes themselves are inevitable. Inevitably, we have to move to global governance. Inevitably, we have to figure out a way to mitigate climate change and to stop polluting our atmosphere with so much carbon. Those things are inevitable. The path to them is not. The path can be long and extremely difficult, or the path can be quite a bit shorter if we unify, bring our world together, connect the nations, and essentially spiritualize the planet, in the words of the Universal House of Justice.
Do you agree that we are many cultures, but one human race?
Of course.
You made an excellent point that for a lot of young people, they don't see a future and they think humanity is doomed. How would you explain a Baha'i view of human nature and of death that would help young people feel less hopeless?
Wow, there's a big question. I have tried to do that with a lot of young people. My wife and I have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. And so we do that often, and typically preach. We try not to preach. we explain that, you know, the Baha'i writings are optimistic about the future, that we have a great deal of hope for the future, that we know that God is watching out for humanity, that we have some difficult days ahead, that we've got a hard road to walk, but at the end of that road, there is a world civilization, the golden age of humanity awaiting us. We probably won't see it in our lifetimes, but the truth is, it is inevitable from a Baha'i perspective. It's hard to tell kids that when they hear this constant drumbeat of terrible news about the world. I really advise people, and I've advised them for years now, even as a journalist, this is hard for me to do, to very carefully pick and choose which news sources you consume. Very carefully. You know, I have worked in journalism for many, many years, and I know the pressures there. I know how difficult journalism is. Baha'u'llah called for a non-profit journalistic sphere in his writings. We don't have that now. Most journalism is driven by profit. And as a result, it tends to focus on the sensational, on what is, you know, the old watchword in television news is, if it bleeds, it leads. And so my counsel to people is, be really careful with what you watch and read, because you can really get, and Hans Rosling's book Factfulness points this out very clearly, you can really get a completely wrong view of what's going on in the world and of humanity itself by consuming the wrong kind of news. My personal recommendation, legitimate national newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, to a lesser degree these days, the Los Angeles Times, none of which are owned by large corporations, but mostly owned and managed by individuals. The Public Broadcasting Service, PBS News, which tends to be nonpartisan, balanced, etc. If you want to watch television news, that's a good one. Avoid cable, avoid network, avoid, you know, the screaming talking heads that you see so often, who have learned that controversy sells. That's not what you want. You want a dispassionate, accurate, and fair reporting of what's actually going on in the world. Another one that I like, and this may cause some consternation, but if you can get it, Al Jazeera has proved to be quite good, actually. You know, their reporting in the rest of the world, in the developing world, is excellent in some cases. So those are the kinds of news organs and outlets that can help adjust your thinking a little bit.
How to achieve unity when we're still divided between democracies and dictatorships?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that one, whoever asked it. One of the things that the Better Angels of Our Nature, Thomas Pinker's book, does is evaluate the progress of the world's governments from dictatorships and autocracies toward democracies. And we have now, interestingly enough, gone over the 50% threshold. That's what the book will tell you. That we have moved from, well, just take, for example, during Baha'u'llah's time, about 80% of the world in the 19th century was governed by dictatorships, kings and queens, tyrants, etc. Today, it's less than 50%. We are in a historical movement away from dictatorships and tyrannical governments toward representative governments. And that historical movement has taken place over the long term. It's not simple, it's not quick, but it is taking place. And you can find the actual statistics on that. And I tend to show those to people and say, I rest my case. Here are the numbers. Look at them and make your own decision. I think it's really powerful to see that more than 50% of the world's governments now are representative democracies. So we're getting there, takes us a while.
World governance is essential, but, quote, laying the groundwork for global civilization calls for the creation of laws and institutions that are universal in both character and authority. The effort can begin only when the concept of the oneness of humanity has been wholeheartedly embraced by those in whose hands the responsibility for decision-making rests, and when the related principles are propagated through both educational systems and the media of mass communication. And then the question is, how do you think we'll be able to achieve this?
I think we are achieving it. I think it's happening right now as we speak. It's hard to find people in the world today who believe that, as Abdul Baha said, there are two trees, the tree of the good and the tree of the evil. We no longer are separated by race, at least scientifically. We no longer are separated by gender, definitely scientifically. We have found through science the real way to understand who humanity is. And that is pervading the world. My wife runs a wonderful educational model called Full Circle Learning that has schools in 40 countries. It's Baha'i inspired. It focuses on the oneness of humanity. And when we go to schools in Africa, for instance, these are village schools that don't even have a building, that take place under a tree in the village. Going to those schools, you really see, especially in the young generation, that they completely accept this idea that human beings are one family. It's no longer a controversial idea in most places. And that is so heartwarming and wonderful. I can't tell you what an impact it'll have on you if you get out in the world and begin to talk to people about these issues. We stay in our living rooms and watch cable news and we think, oh my goodness, humanity is doomed. It's not, folks. There is a huge amount of hope and wonder and just optimism, especially if you're out among people who are young, and especially if that happens outside Western civilization, as it's called. I was reminded the other day what Gandhi said on that in that regard. A British journalist, asked him once what he thought of Western civilization, and Gandhi said, "I think it would be a good idea."
The next question is, what magazines would you recommend?
Magazines. Gosh, magazine journalism, sad to say, has declined over the last many, many years. But there are many still good magazines out there. The one that I like personally the most is The Atlantic. The Atlantic is terrific, as is National Geographic. It gives you a real sense of the oneness of the world. But The Atlantic has great writing in it, very few illustrations, excellent writing. New Yorker is spotty these days, in my view. Terrific articles in some cases, not so great in others. But The Atlantic and National Geographic, if you subscribe to those two, you'll get a pretty balanced view. Another terrific, it's not a magazine, it's a newspaper, is Christian Science Monitor. They do an excellent, very fair and balanced job. But I read two newspapers every morning, New York Times, Washington Post, compare the two. I have to remind myself as I do that the editorial pages are both have liberal leanings, and for that reason, just to stay balanced, I don't read that many editorials. Somebody just posted another one. What was it? Christian Science Monitor. The Smithsonian. Yeah, excellent scientific magazine. Terrific articles there as well.
As a journalist, what is journalists' role in informing the populace about current issues versus the role of scientists in the same respect?
Oh boy, that's a huge one. For me, I constantly go back to what Baha'u'llah said about journalism and what Abdu'l-Baha said as well. And Baha'u'llah said that journalists are the eyes of humanity, and that we need to see and report fairly on what is truly happening. He said that the organs of journalism, and he used the phrase swiftly appearing newspapers. That was during the days of yellow journalism, by the way, when there are hundreds of newspapers appearing very swiftly. But you could also maybe apply it to the internet these days, because there are many swiftly appearing pages there. I saw a New Yorker cartoon the other day with a guy sitting in his kitchen table in his bathrobe, bleary-eyed, and his wife is coming through the door, and he says, "I finally did it. I finished the internet." We all know that's not possible. So anyway, Baha'u'llah said that the organs of journalism should not be controlled by profit-making organizations. And for me, that's profound. Very little journalism makes a profit these days, of course. So that may be part of the testing process that we're going through. Thank you. Somebody just posted, Sue, thanks. She just posted that quotation from Baha'u'llah. But once we move away, and I think we will inevitably, from profit-making corporations controlling our news and our news consumption, we'll all be better off.
Thank you. Well, looks like that's all of our questions, and we're all almost at time. So thank you so much for your talk, and this was a great Q&A as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. Really appreciate you coming, and thank you for your ears.
Thank you so much. So this talk will be posted on our YouTube channel in a few days. And if you're not subscribed, I've put the link to that in the chat. And our speaker next week will be Dr. Noura Mozoon, and her topic will be conflict in interpersonal and romantic relationships, a Baha'i perspective. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Bye.